Are you curious about Gestalt language processing? You are not alone. Join me, Corinne Smoose, and speech therapy PD for our podcast, The Gestalt Get Together. Our episodes try to balance the enthusiasm and excitement about GLP and its associated intervention ideas, as well as a healthy dose of skepticism about how to understand and integrate this paradigm shift into your career and the field at large. We hope that you can get together with us to learn more about Gestalts.
Welcome to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. This podcast is designed for the adult medical speech-language pathologist. Most of our audience members work in settings such as acute care hospitals, private practice, outpatient hospital clinics, and inpatient rehabilitation hospitals. Each episode has an accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The content of this course is based on the research and experience of the presenters. The listener is responsible for researching to determine if the information and skills taught are appropriate for their clients, students, or patients. SpeechTherapyPD.com does not necessarily endorse, recommend, or favor the information shared, nor any of the claims, opinions, statements, offers, or services made by the presenter. Hello, and welcome, everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I am your SpeechTherapyPD.com podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. Here are the financial and non-financial disclosures. Jennifer Ruckner is the co-founder of Tots to Teens Therapy Services. She receives compensation from SpeechTherapyPD.com for this presentation. Her non-financial disclosure is that she sits on the Foundation's first board of directors and is on the 2024 ASHA Convention Planning Committee for Pediatric Feeding and Swallowing and the Prince William County Chamber of Commerce. My financial disclosure is that I'm a paid employee of a private consulting firm in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I'm the host of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, and I receive financial reimbursement for this and other webinars on SpeechTherapyPD.com. I'm also adjunct faculty for James Madison University and Old Dominion University. My non-financial disclosure is that I am the secretary for the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Questions can be written in the chat box or the Q&A and will be answered throughout the presentation. Now, without further ado, we welcome our guest, Jennifer Ruckner, MS, CCC-SLP. Jennifer Ruckner received her Bachelor's of Science degree and Master's degree in Communication Disorders from Auburn University. She has been a speech-language pathologist since 1990, working in a variety of settings, including early intervention, school districts, and private practice. Jennifer piloted a preschool expressive language program for Stafford County Schools. She specializes in social and pragmatic language, autism spectrum disorder, expressive language disorder, and feeding disorders, and is also Beckman Oral Motor certified. She provides services through telepractice and at home, and in 2008, she and partner Patty Minucci created Tots to Teens Therapy Services to provide speech and language resources in an interdisciplinary approach to the families of Northern Virginia. Jennifer is a community ambassador for Feeding Matters, a nonprofit parent-founded organization. Whew, big words. Welcome, Jennifer. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. You too, Renee. After 30 years, you've got a lot of stuff you've done.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's good because I think that, shows that you didn't only do the one thing that you got paid to do, which, me, I'm a big proponent of volunteerism. So I just want to say thank you on a personal level for entertaining me by saying yes to the podcast, because that you and I have chatted before about private practice and just the importance of understanding what you're getting yourself into. And I say that more like for me, but just kind of understanding the places that you need to start and the lessons that you learn. So I appreciate you sharing that information. So let's just talk a little bit about how you got started and how this journey sort of evolved?
Sure. Well, it was one of those things that I kind of always felt like I wanted to have some kind of business. I don't know why, but I started out at Auburn in the business department. And after 2 years of being in business, it was not quite fast paced enough for me and a little too dry. So, my personality is not one, as you very well know, not one to just sit and do numbers. So, I decided I needed something different, went into speech because I have an aunt who was a speech pathologist and had told me about it. I always loved working with kids, so that was always my jam. And so basically, I ended up kind of, I won't say it was happenstance, but it was kind of happenstance. I ended up in 2007 having cancer, which obviously I'm here. So it was a good prognosis. And I just wanted to be near where my kids were. And I wanted to be more on their schedule, not on a completely different school schedule than what they were on. And so I started talking and reaching out to different people. But I came across a friend who was moving out of Virginia because where we live is high military area, and she was a military spouse. She only had 5 kids, but she was like, "Hey, Jen, I know you can take these for me and you just do it." Well, I took those 5 kids and I decided I was just going to quit the schools and just start from there. And then Patty was also in the schools and she wanted kind of the same thing I did, which was to have more availability for her kids. So we started with 5 kids and 2 speech pathologists going into the homes, and it just sort of evolved from there. A lot of lessons I have learned over the last 16 years, and we look completely different now than when we started. And, we went from private pay to now we're insurance primarily. I mean, just a lot of changes in the 16 years. So, but I do not regret a single decision of leaving the schools and then going into private practice. But there have been a lot of lessons, some hard, some not hard, that I've had to learn along the way.
Yeah, and I know some people, when they do private practice, they just strictly kind of stick with themselves and maybe one other SLP, but you and Patty added on more of an interdisciplinary team. So when did that kind of evolve and take place?
We were primarily going and doing more home health type and early intervention. That was primarily where we were when we started. And I wrote a contract with our local county for early intervention. So we were doing a lot of that. Over time, we just saw such a need for other disciplines. And it seemed like, I mean, the more you work with other disciplines, it makes you a better therapist too, because you're having to look outside of your speech bubble and all of that. And so we really wanted to do that, but we just weren't sure how. But then it sort of just evolved. Like we would meet someone and they would say, "Oh, I've got a friend that's an OT, or I have a friend that's a PT. Are you guys looking for someone?" And that's kind of what happened. A lot of what we had early on was pretty much all word of mouth. And that's kind of how we ended up. We ended up with one OT, and there were about 3 or 4 speech pathologists at the time. And it just sort of kept growing. And as people heard about us, the need for more therapists coming, and then it just kept growing. And so we now have 27 on staff and 2 clinics. And we have about as many OTs. We're like one short the same number of OTs in speech, and we have one PT. So, yeah, so it's just sort of kind of grown from there. And it's usually done by what our need is and what we see the area needs for services.
Well, and your clinic is also unique because you serve not only, like I said in your bio, telepractice and home visits, but you actually have like a stand up, like brick and mortar
Mhm.
office.
Yeah, other than early intervention, we've had to kind of stop doing home health because unless you're truly a home health, which we were not, insurance will not pay for it. And so it meant that we had to look into other means. And so the other means were to open an actual brick and mortar location. So we started, it was kind of crazy because we started with my house. The room that I'm sitting in now was a therapy room. Do not recommend that move, but it met our need at the time because our early intervention caseload was so much higher in this immediate area. So we didn't need a whole lot at the time. And then we had a brick and mortar office that was in Stafford County, which we're no longer down in Stafford County. We moved everything up to the county I'm in now. And then we outgrew my house pretty quickly. And so we had to get something else. So we ended up opening a clinic about 5 minutes from my house, which is ideal. And that worked out pretty well until we outgrew it. And then it luckily had some extra space. So we just kind of added on with the space that was already there. And then we outgrew the Stafford location and we couldn't really find what we were looking for down there. So we found something back in August. Well, we moved in August last year into our second location. And now that one's just continued to blossom. And I mean, it's been fun, but I won't lie, it is a little stressful at times when you're growing in different directions constantly. But it challenges you, that's for sure.
Well, and I know one of the things that we've talked about before is just the professionals that you look at seeking out when you're starting. Because I know for like our area, we're seeing a lot of, I mean, I still consider someone, even if they got their C's 1 or 2 years ago, they're still to me really new to the field. But we're seeing a lot of that sort of 2 to 5 years in practice in our area going into private practice. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes I worry that without that, like you had a business background, you kind of had that acumen of knowing what you may need to have. I think there's always, like you said, too, going to be some trial and error and some things maybe you don't know and maybe you didn't plan for. But, what are those professionals that you really need to be thinking from the get go, from the beginning, who you will need to have when you're starting out?
You definitely need a good accountant. That's a must because the way you set your business up determines how your taxes are done. That's a big one, especially with it being tax day today. That is a big one. The way that our company runs now is not the way that it was running when we first started, because when we first started, we were an LLC. Now we're an S Corp. So now everything runs through my husband and I. So you need a good accountant who understands small business. That's critical. As you are putting together your business, you will want some kind of small business attorney who can help you come up with articles of incorporation if you want to be a corporation, or just to help you do the paperwork and things for an LLC. You can probably get, if you're doing LLC, you can probably get accountants to help you with that. A lot of accountants are very aware what that paperwork looks like, but it's just really a good idea. In the state of Virginia, we have had to make a lot of changes because laws have changed.
Mhm.
So one of our biggest changes, we started out with everybody being a 1099 contractor. That's how everybody started out. We could hire people pretty easily. There were not a whole lot of restrictions for us. That changed dramatically in 2021. And it revamped everything that I did. And I had to then, I couldn't, almost everybody on my staff at the time had to become an employee, whether it was an hourly employee or a salaried employee, because of a pretty much a massive statewide crackdown on 1099 employees or contractors. So, knowing those kinds of ins and outs, it's really, really important there's a lot of people, I'm not going to lie to you, there's a lot of people out there that don't know the law, and I hear stuff all the time and I'm like, "Oh, you better check on that just to make sure." So having a good small business attorney just to ask questions to and things like that, very critical. Where I am, we have small business organizations. So I can contact them if I'm looking for some help with maybe some marketing, or maybe I want to expand and I need a loan. They'll help me to find the best person or the best bank or whatever to go through. They might help me with contractors. I need a contractor to come in and do some work for me or things like that. So, seeing what kind of services are there in your own community to see where you can kind of pull from some of the resources that are there. Actually, I'm going the end of the month, they're having a small business conference here. And so just being able to go to things like that from time to time. I haven't been in a while. It's been probably 2 years since I've been able to go, but just to get some resources that are right here in my county so that I know what's available. There's grants out there that help you to pay for certain things that you wouldn't even know about unless you were involved in your community. So those are definitely some professionals that I would say are definites that you will want to get in contact with. It was very helpful for me because I did have to change everyone over to employee. It was very helpful for me to do the Chamber of Commerce because I then would meet people in the insurance industry so that I was getting liability insurance for our company that covered all of the building insurance requirements that our landlords wanted, things like that. Health insurance for my employees. I had no idea how to do that. So, having somebody that could help me to negotiate those kinds of things. Also, setting up our payroll system. We hired somebody to come in and help us set that up. And it wasn't a big cost, but it was somebody who had knowledge in it. It was a quick process. And then we got our payroll system up and running. So, it's the little things like that that you don't always think about, but they can make your life so much better. Or you're going to have a lot of headaches and then you're like, oh, I wish I knew somebody that did that. So yeah.
Yeah, that's what it's really, I guess I like to say it's none of my business because, I just worry about this influx of people in our area because I mean, literally, I know at least 5 or 6 of my former students who are less than 5 years in practice who have started like a home health practice. And so, thinking about all of those things because it is very important. You want to be able, bottom line, to protect yourself, but also to protect your clients and your patients even
Mhm.
if it's you as a sole practitioner or maybe you have one person like you did first starting out, there's still a lot of things in the details that I don't think you just inherently know until you have the experience or unless you really dive in and do the research. Even thinking about the different business structures that you mentioned, because one of the things I'm seeing a lot of people start LLC and then they want to be in a PLLC. And not that you're an attorney or able to give any kind of legal advice. This is just more of a conversation for those listeners. What are the different business structures? Like, what's the difference between an LLC and a PLLC? Or do you know?
So
I don't.
I am not as familiar with LLC because that was not something that was a structure that's a newer structure. So I didn't really have as much, information with that. But, there's different, like there's sole proprietor. So that's just somebody coming out, just opening a private practice by themselves. However, all of your assets and everything are open, I guess is the best way to say, when you're a sole proprietor. So you want to have some kind of legal entity that protects your personal. That's the main thing. That's why you have these different kinds of legal entities, is because you're trying to figure out what is the best way to protect your personal assets. The LLC is limited liability corporation. That one is usually a sole proprietor, but who opens up a business and that gives them a little bit of coverage. We ended up doing an S Corp. There's also a C Corp out there. We did that because it was more protection for my husband and I, and because I had, younger kids at the time, and I didn't want our personal, like our home or our, vehicles or our money or anything like that to be affected if something, were to happen with the business. I wanted those to be completely separate. And then of course, you've got nonprofit corporations as well. And there are a lot, that's a 501c3. There are a lot of ins and outs about that. So you've got to meet a lot of criterion. One of the things is you have a board, and the board is the one, even though you're the one who might run it and you're the owner of it, the board is the one who makes all of the decisions and things like that. So that's a little bit different than an S Corp, where I pretty much am the CEO, but I also run the board. I do have board members, and I can, in my legal documents, it says how many board members I can have and things like that. And the board as a whole makes decisions, but I am the head of that board. So I have a little more say so. You can't do that with a nonprofit. So, there's a lot of ins and outs. The best way to figure which one's the best for you is to talk to that, like I said, a small business attorney, because they're going to be able to tell you all of the legal ramifications, but they can also tell you some of the financial ramifications as well.
Yeah, mind blown. Well, and I think too, one of the things that kind of came up too, and I've heard other people saying this, is if you start out as private pay, how does that evolve? Because there's so many different rules for insurance. And I know that there's some people locally who are doing private pay and or Medicare. But, and even for me, I've been doing this for 15-ish years now, and I still wouldn't have a clue as to where to start because I've always worked for a health system or a private firm.
It is exactly what you said. It is a little crazy. I'm just going to put it out there. We started out all as private pay. What the downside of private pay is, it depends on the area that you live in, obviously. The more affluent an area is, the better private pay usually is. If you don't have that affluent area, then it's only going to be for small periods of time because people can't afford to do it on a regular basis. So we would find that, somebody would start out super strong, paying, and then all of a sudden we wouldn't see them, and then they were owing money. We've changed the way we also now do our payments, so that helps. At the time, we were so small, we were just doing monthly payments, and that when you're doing a payment per service, that's a different model. And that's now what we do. And so that's not as big of a problem. But also, insurance varies so much. You want a good billing person. A lot of I'm going to put this out there. I have a very strong preference, so I'm not going to try to say what my preference is. But there are billing companies out there that you can hire a billing company to come in and do all of your billing for the visits that you have. So they'll take care of whatever insurance and things like that you have. Or your other alternative is you hire an in-house person, but you want to make sure that that in-house person is very knowledgeable when it comes to how to bill for, insurance and things like that. How do they look through a plan and know what the plan pays for? They need to be on top of it. They need to be fastidious with their remits and things like that, because some insurance companies have a time limit that if you miss their time limit, you just don't get paid. So there's definitely things like that you have to kind of think about when you're looking at bringing insurance into the picture. For us, as we grew, the ability to do all private pay was not a reality because we just didn't have that influx of, the higher income families who were coming to us. We have a lot of military families. Military families do really well, but they have great insurance through TRICARE, so they don't want to pay private pay when they have this insurance. So
Right.
things like that. So I will tell you, the goal for most of the billing companies when you hire them out is to achieve 80% return on the claims that you put in. So if that's okay for your practice to only get 80%, then a billing company would be good. Not everybody will say that that's what they get, but that's the standard industry is 80%. But if you get a really good billing person, they're hitting a lot higher than that, which means that's just more money back into the company to be able to provide the best services for your families and your children or adults. So I definitely would say if you can find that good billing person, they can be just a total, diamond in the rough in your system. Unfortunately, you hear just as many stories about people that didn't know billing well enough and then it didn't end up going as well. So it's a touchy thing. But I want to answer your question about how to do insurance. You have to have a contract with insurance companies. You have to try to negotiate rates if they're willing to. A lot of them will have a cap and that's all they're going to pay. It doesn't matter how many times you talk to them. It doesn't matter. They're not going to give you any more. TRICARE is one of those. They pay a daily, not a daily rate, but they pay a rate and it will not go over that number. And it's dependent upon your region and where you're located.
Yeah. And isn't there some time as far as like when you apply to work with that insurance payer and like when you get I don't know if approval is the correct word, like approved to be able to bill that insurance? Isn't there some time that, is built into
Yes,
the
and
structure?
yes, it's credentialing. And so whenever you do an application, we're actually in the middle of we got contacted by a insurance company who typically does not hire outside of their own industry. But because there's a shortage where we are, they have asked if we would become providers with them. So you fill out whatever their application process is. You have to show that you have, this is also really important. Your accountant will help you with this, but you have to have a tax ID number, an NPI number for your company. You also have to have NPI numbers for every individual who works for you. You have to have credentialing, which also is credentialing for every single person that works for you. And so you have to show those things. You have to show that you have liability insurance and how much liability is dependent upon each insurance companies. Most of them are about the same. So a general liability policy usually is adequate for most insurance companies. So you have a whole process that you have to go through. And then it takes a while, like you were saying, it takes that little bit of time between credentialing. And it really varies according to what their need is as to how fast that's going to happen. And also, like this one particular one, I would think would probably move a little bit faster because they are trying to find providers to come work for them. But if they're full and they have a lot of providers, then they don't tend to move nearly as fast. So a lot of that is dependent on the need and demand.
Yeah. And I know from when I worked at assisted living, I did some PRN work a few years back and we all had to it was a similar structure. We had to have our own NPI number, but the company itself had an NPI number. But the nice thing about having that is if you have it and then you go somewhere else as a provider, or say you wanted to start your private practice, you have a starting point because that NPI number doesn't go away. So it's kind of a nice thing to have because I know even for those people who do like private clients on the side, they need to know that too. Because I think that's another big driving force is not to start out with a full on practice, but to maybe take on private clients on the side here and there. And I think really that is probably one of the bigger driving forces behind doing this with you is just to get that information out there because, again, it's hard to know what all the steps and things are and where to start, and having that sort of stepping stone with the two big, I think the two big ones are having that accountant and then having the small business attorney to help you figure out those little nuanced details, because we don't just come out of speech school and audiology school knowing that stuff. So,
No, for sure. And, one of the things, as you were talking about, the people who do it on the side, a lot of people who do it on the side don't think about, hey, that's my small business. That is your small business. And you want to protect that small business, and putting it under Jennifer Ruckner is not a good way to do that. The best way to do it is to create an LLC. That's a great time to have an LLC, as if you're just doing some things on the side, because it protects that entity by itself. And that can be something that protects you then too. A lot of people don't think about that, but that's another good thing to have in your back pocket.
yeah, and I tell people that too, just from being in the healthcare system, having your own liability insurance, because even when you work under the umbrella of the hospital or health system, just because they have liability insurance, they'll tell you that you're covered. They will drop you so fast. So you need to be protecting yourself no matter what your setting is, because that is a slippery slope. And like you said, we don't go into this thinking that something bad is going to happen, or someone that maybe works with you or for you is going to make a mistake, but you have to be proactive with that kind of stuff.
You do, because not everybody, it's little things that we know. Because I think that goes back a little bit to what you were kind of alluding to earlier with, we've had that experience of being in the field for a while. We've seen some of those mistakes people have made, so that it makes us more aware of, some of those ethical issues that are out there, and what conflict of interest means, and, those kinds of things. And if you haven't had that background experience yet, or that life experience yet, it's hard to sometimes recognize this, because sometimes they don't look bad. I don't know if bad's the word, but, they don't look like it's going to be a problem until it's a problem.
Yeah.
You know what
And
I mean?
yeah, because you and I both know someone who I would have never thought would have made such an egregious error that really did something that was so, to me, was so left field of, that wound up being really detrimental to the entire practice. And
Hmm.
I won't want to like go into detail, but you know, and again, when you start bringing in people, having, my husband always says, don't work with friends and family, but sort of having that vetted, credentialed person, that's important, because one of the things that I kept seeing, having supervisors that were not speech discipline, they were doing things with trying to have CFs be mentored by someone that was never on site, trying to give CF students all kinds of things like that. And so, again, going back to really knowing what our ethical rules are and what our code of ethics looks like, whether or not people agree with having their C's or whatever, I don't want to have that discussion. But again, that runs into potential legal issues. And that's the part where you really need to be well versed and mindful of what you're doing and how you're laying things out in your business.
Exactly. And, there's definitely, even with insurance, like, you have to think about those kinds of things, because, we have a couple of codas that work for us. And codas, there's certain guidelines that we have to follow when a coda works for us. If they have a child with TRICARE, then I need to have a OTR on site during that time period in order for them to see that child. That's one of those things. I would not have known that as a speech person, because that wasn't something we did. And so, because for CFs, it's a little bit different. There's a different rule. And, so it's really important to have supervisor. This is my opinion. So take it or leave it. But it's really important to have supervisors in multiple disciplines if you're going to have multiple disciplines, because there are so many ins and outs. Like our license for Virginia is only a year, but PT, it's 2 years. I mean, just quirky things like that. Why? We're all in the same department. Why can't we just all have the same? Nope, it's all different. So, you just need to have the right people on your team with you as well. And I will tell you, my clinical director is an OT and she is my right hand person. Without her, she takes care of that side of things where I take care of the speech side of things. And that makes a really good pairing when you've got those multiple disciplines together.
We do have a question. It says, can you
Okay.
give us some examples of conflicts of interest?
Sure. Okay, let's see here. There's several. So within private practice, one of the conflicts of interest that happens often with families that come to us is, we can only provide so many sessions for that child because multiple reasons. Maybe insurance won't reimburse for a certain amount. Their reimbursement doesn't cover an hour session, it only will cover a half hour session, and they want more, but we don't have anybody to provide more. I've had parents then ask their therapist if they'll come to their house and do private therapy with them at home. That's a conflict of interest for multiple reasons. I mean, obviously, for our company, that was a conflict of interest. But for that speech pathologist, that's a conflict of interest to see them in the two locations. We also have a contract with the insurance company that says that we will not bill them separately from what their rates are within their policy. So if
Mhm.
my therapist then goes to their home and they're paying them under the table, we could potentially lose our contract with that insurance agency because we are committing a conflict of interest, even though I didn't know anything about it. So that's an example. Another example is sometimes we'll have, because we have a lot of after school kiddos. That seems to always be the need that we have our therapists for after school kiddos. But and sometimes we hire school therapists to work for us in the afternoons after they get off work. Well, if they're seeing a child at that school and then they know that that child comes here, we need to know so that they're not seeing that child in both settings for similar reasons to what I just said, but not because of insurance. It's just a conflict of interest because the school is looking at that child from an educational standpoint and writing goals according to that. We are looking at a child from a medically necessary standpoint and we are writing goals to that. And those things don't always line up. And we would not want to have the same therapist working both of those sides of it. So that's another one. I'm trying to think of some other practical things that I know have happened to us personally. We've had some people who, this hasn't happened to me, but there's been some in the area that I know they would go work for one private practice clinic and then they come work for another private practice clinic. And there's a lot of HIPAA oopsies that happen when you're working two different clinics. And there's information at this clinic that you probably should not be privy to if you're working at this clinic. And they're usually HIPAA related type things. And you wouldn't also, same kind of thing, you wouldn't want to work at two different clinics with the same child. So those are just some of the conflicts of interest. There's a lot of different ones out there, but those are the ones that happen in the private practice world pretty regularly, I would say.
Yeah, and in the adult world too, because
Mhm.
I know even in outpatient, I had clients that would say, "I know my insurance will only cover this. Can you come to my house and do more?" And I would be like, "Absolutely not. I'm sorry. You're a great patient, but that is, a conflict of interest." And matter of fact, when I was a CF, the two competing health systems here used to have people who would be full time for one and not for the other who wanted to PRN because maybe that hospital was closer to their home and they used to have a non-compete clause and wouldn't let you do that.
Mhm.
They wound up getting rid of it because I think one of the not-for-profit statuses changed, and so you wound up being able to work for both. Because again, there's been many times where when I worked at the One Health system and then I was PRN, you sometimes not at the same time, but I've definitely had patients that I saw at one hospital and maybe a year later now they're at this hospital. Because when they have discharge disposition to a skilled nursing facility and they have to be admitted to the hospital, they typically will take them to the closest hospital, but if that one's not accepting new admissions, they gotta go somewhere. So
Mhm.
you may see that kinda back and forth. And then another one would be if you've worked with anybody who resides in a group home as an adult, same thing, you may see them at one health system, and the next time they get sick, they're at the different one, or maybe they've moved to a different group home, and now this hospital system serves them more because it's closer to where they reside now. So, that's not technically a conflict of interest because it's not happening at the same time, but you can see where it gets a little sticky depending.
Mhm.
You have to know, like you said, you have to know what the rules are for insurance, but you also have to be mindful of protecting yourself and protecting the privacy of your patients. Because the rule is that if you say, like, I had someone from one of the group homes I work with who was under 18, it may be they've moved up where you are. Would it be a conflict of interest for me to recommend if they wanted to do direct therapy services to come to your practice? Well, I don't necessarily think so because what you do is you provide a list. You don't just provide one
Mhm.
provider. So I think that's another one where people get into some what could be an appearance of conflict of interest. So, like for me, when we're doing disclosures for financial and non-financial, I've had people say, "Well, you don't really have to disclose that." The rule of thumb I've always heard is if it's a question in your mind, go ahead and disclose it. And I think that's true for working across those two different entities, whether it's education and medical settings or vice versa. So that was I think, a really great point.
Mhm.
So, what kind of factors would you say for potential future private practice owners that, would really be considerations before moving forward with that move to a private practice?
Well, there how much longer do we have here? No,
So-
there are definitely lots of things to kind of consider. You want to look at, how much are you willing to put into this company? How much of your own blood, sweat, and tears are you willing to do? Because, you know, there's so many great things about private practice, but you really have to want to do it. I'll say that. You also, you know, have to find a good balance because I think a lot of times when we are looking to start, we throw everything in all at once, and then we don't necessarily think about, the reason why we started. I mean, the whole reason I started was to spend time with my family. That was why I started. So making sure you remember why you have a why, because I spent a lot of after hours on the phone because people would call me after hours and I felt like I couldn't miss their call because if I missed their call, then I wouldn't have that potential client. That
Yeah.
is false. And do not put yourself, the whole reason was to spend time with my kids. And I found myself answering the phone at times that were just, I'm in the middle of cooking dinner and I'm like, okay, let me talk to you, and my kids used to laugh because if we were in the car, I would say, I'd like point to, and they would know that they're supposed to start taking notes as to a phone number for me because I couldn't write it down or something. So they used to say, Mom, I'm not your secretary. So, just remembering things like that. Like, why are you doing this? Making sure that you find that good balance
Mhm.
between, because a lot of times your life becomes that way at home, at work, on the weekends, all of that. So making sure that you have cutoff points. I got really good at, okay, it's 5:45 and I'm done for today. Whatever I have will wait till tomorrow. That was a hard lesson for me, a very hard lesson. Some of the other things is you need to diversify how you're going to go about getting clients, because if you try to put all those eggs into one basket, what happens if that insurance company no longer pays? Then you have nothing, you know? So we started early on doing that. We had about 50% were early intervention, 50% were private pay. And that evolved to less and less and less of those two, and then adding a couple of insurance companies in there. So now we've got about 5 different sources of income. Fortunately, unfortunately, 3 of them are insurance, but the other, we still diversify. So not all our eggs are in one insurance basket, not one contract that we have, things like that. So that would be another thing that I would say, making sure. The biggest thing, as I said, I've been in business now 16 years. What I started out as looks absolutely nothing like it does now. And it changes constantly. And as soon as you think that you've got it down, something will happen. A law will change. An insurance rule policy will change. Something will happen. And you're like, oh man, I just got all this all figured out. And now they're changing it on me again. So flexibility and remembering everything will change. And it's okay. It's okay. If you've got your ducks in a row, you're going to be able to make those changes gradually as they're happening. So those are really important.
And another, referral sources, because your referral sources are key in, getting your business up and running. But then also, what if something happens and someone decides that they, if it's another, say it's an ENT practice or a GI practice, and they decide that they're going to close, or they're selling it, or they're retiring, there's no guarantee that that referral source is going to continue to be available. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. When we first started, it was Beth, who is my clinical director. She jokes and she said, we were like this undercover, like nobody knew we were there. It was just a word of mouth. Hey, I heard about Tots to Teens. That was kind of how we started. And it was a big word of mouth. Even to this day, so much of what the feedback we get is word of mouth, because we have such a big military community. I mean, if we mess up, the whole military community that's moving here is going to know about it. But if we do something really fantastic, which luckily for us, knock on wood, has been the case, then people, when they move here, they're contacting us sometimes even before they get here, which is fantastic. But you're right. I mean, you have to diversify. We do not look at just pediatricians for our referrals. We look at orthodontists. We look at pediatric dentists. We look at private preschools, because they're the ones that are meeting with those parents, and then they're referring, and thinking outside the box. I mean, we do a lot of things for the community. So we provide free presentations that are related to different things, sensory needs. That's one of the big things that we do, because, us as SLPs don't know a whole lot about sensory needs sometimes. And I think even more so with our preschool teachers that are getting all these little ones in, and they don't know what to do with them, So we've been doing a lot of educating and things like that. But what that does, it's twofold. We're educating so that they've got tools that they need that make them better at what they're doing, because they're our first line of defense with these families and these little ones. And then second fold is Tots to Teens is on their mind. Oh, you remember Jen came and she talked to us about blah, 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 And so a lot of times we'll get calls about, hey, I've got this concern about this kiddo. And so we're able to help in ways out in the community that hasn't been met before. So really thinking about how you're going to get those referrals is really important, and it takes a lot of time.
Mhm.
I'll just say that. It is a effort of love because you're building relationships is what you're doing with lots of people in your community.
Yeah, and even in the adult world, it's the same thing because if you like when I went to outpatient, it was a new program. And
Mm.
so I went to the family practice office in our building. I went to some of the other physicians I had worked with at the hospital, like the GI doctor's office, and we had little marketing brochures and stuff like that. But I agree, the big one to me is really that community education because and people who've listened know I say this all the time. Community education, especially for preventable health conditions, is still so lacking. And so in so many areas, because I'm in a high military area too, but I'm also in a adjacent rural area. So we kind of go from one thing to another to a bigger city, out at the beach, there's almost 2 million people out there. And so you get a very wide variety of socioeconomic statuses, and not everyone is privy to community health education and certainly not well versed in these things that could be preventable or maybe, in the case of pediatrics, mitigated early on, like with early intervention or sensory needs. And so, yeah, I think that is a great service that is provided. And it is a great way to not only access the community, but guess who else is at those community health fairs and things like that?
Mhm.
Referral sources like other private practice specialty clinics, maybe audiology clinics as well. So it's sort of like the world is your oyster, but figuring out how to make the oyster get it out of the shell sometimes is the tricky part. Is there something you wish you had known before you started out in the private practice that you feel like if you could go back and like future
Hmm.
Jen could tell baby Jen?
I think just giving myself grace sometimes would have been really nice. I was
Mhm,
really hard on myself and had very high expectations for me, but it ended up being really good because my former business partner, Patty, ended up retiring. And so I didn't really expect that to happen. We both had always talked that we would retire at the same time and things like this. And during COVID, there were just some changes for her that happened, and she was able to do that early. And I wasn't. And so, I think just remembering that just like everything changes, learning is you're never going to know everything. I mean, we should already know this as speech pathologists. You're not going to know everything. You've got to always keep learning. It is no different with having a private practice. And the more people you bring on, there's more things. Just like if you have more children, there's more things that you're dealing with. And so just keeping that in mind. I mean, I really love my staff and I feel like we're just one big family. I tend to be the oldest, so I'm the mom of the group most of the time. But I think it's a very interesting balance between doing what is best for your therapist and doing what is best for the clients.
mhm.
Because there's times that you can't make both sides happy at the same time because the therapists are saying, "Oh, I've got too many kids," or whatever, and the clients are like, "I want more services." And so it's always like this nice dance that you do, but if you're trying your best to think what is best practice and a good life balance for those therapists, you're gonna find compromising points that can make both sides happy. But just know that that also is sort of like a little dance that waves from time to time as well.
Yeah, so giving yourself grace, and I think summing up kind of what you talked about with doing it so that you could have more time with your family, setting boundaries. Uh,
Mhm.
and that's again, that's something I sometimes see, and I saw definitely an outpatient when I went over there, and we were a brand new. The speech and the pediatric speech clinics were both brand new, and there was a lot of expectation for giving out your personal phone number and your personal email so that they could contact you. And it's, again, to me, that's a conflict of interest because my time is my time. I think that's a harder thing for less seasoned clinicians because the expectation is to be available at all times. And that, especially when you work for a bigger health system, they put that pressure on the younger clinicians and less seasoned clinicians, and it's really not fair, and it's not appropriate. No one should be contacting you. You shouldn't be working off the clock. The sort of that expectation of doing your documentation when you get home after you clocked out, or you're only getting paid for 8 hours and you're working 2 extra at home. Again, having those boundaries for yourself, but also for your staff, I think is really important. Fortunately, now I'm working for someone who's really great about most of those things. So I went to the doctor last week and he said, "Everything looks great. How are you feeling?" I was like, "You know what? I lost 500 pounds of trash when I quit my job." He was like, "Oh my gosh, that's so funny." But it's a challenge because as SLPs, and I think most audiologists too would agree, we get into the profession because we want to help other people. And sometimes that means we do that to the detriment of ourselves. And it's definitely a learned skill, particularly to those of us that have, families, or whether, whatever that family situation looks like, whether you're the sandwich generation caring for kids and parents at the same time, or whatever that looks like. I think it's really hard to turn that off at the end of the day. And it's a learned, it almost has to like hammer it into yourself so that you don't feel bad about it and feel guilty. So I think that's probably a universal theme across practice settings. It's not unique to private practice, but I think if you're the sole person, or maybe you have one partner, I could see where that could be a little bit more of a challenge because you have so much to do and you want to get everything done and you want to be successful and you want to be good for your clients and your patients. And we can't always be everything all at once, like the movie.
That's
Everything
right.
all at once. Yeah, that is definitely a challenge. Looks like we have another question. What are the best techniques for turning work off at the end of the day?
I'm going to try to give you some good answers for that. I just remember, do what I say, but not what I do, because sometimes I did not do this. I think just kind of like I would try to set certain like guidelines, like I need to get these things have to be done today, like payroll, for instance. Now I've got somebody to do the payroll, so that's a nice thing, but like I have to do X, Y, and Z today. These are important. Like really prioritizing what has to be done. And then there's other things that would be nice to get done, but not necessarily have a timeline. And those I would say, be okay with those can wait till tomorrow. Like I said, you're always going to have something that's going to be on your docket to do as a business owner. It's just the way it is because there are so many things that you're trying to juggle. So, making sure that you're okay with turning that off. I also, when you have a business, especially with people working for you, somebody's going to call out sick. There's certain things like that you just have to know at 6 a.m. in the morning when Sally's sick and I've got to now figure out how we're going to get all those clients seen or rescheduled or whatever we're going to do with them that day. How do you do that at 6 a.m.? So having certain policies in place that if this happens, here's what we're going to do. That really helped me to figure out, especially as I had a few admin people, that I could kind of divvy some of it up, because it's really hard to be like the sole person doing everything. But, knowing that if Sally calls in at 6 a.m., she's going to contact her first 2 clients so that they know that, that somebody will contact them later to reschedule. So that kind of takes that pressure off of you so that you can kind of get going. And then you've got a system of how you're going to call the rest of those clients, either you or another person. So I think just kind of thinking through different scenarios like that and setting policies are a good way to kind of figure out, those techniques that you need in place so that you can turn it off. I am with Renee 110% in the fact that you should not have to use your personal phone to contact families, and they should not have that. I cannot say we always did that because that was not the case, because there just weren't as many. There were phone systems when we first started, but not all of the apps and things that they have now. But Zoom, which we're on today, Zoom has a whole phone system where you can do a whole app, and that's what we use. So everybody has a Zoom phone number that their
Google phone
clients,
number.
yep, that their clients call them on, and they can text them on it and all the things that we normally would do. So having something like that helps you set a boundary as well, because you can put time limits on when those phone calls are going to come through, which is spectacular. I did not have that. I only had my cell phone, and everybody that ever knew me had my personal cell phone number, which is not ideal at all. So those are some of the things that are not easy, but things that you can put in place that will help you to set those limits for you. And I think kind of just keeping in mind, this won't be an everyday thing, but kind of have a timeline. I want to work from 8:30 to 4:30, and then after 4:30, I'm cutting off. Realizing that won't happen every single day, but like in your mind, when it's just like if you go into a clinic or go into a work setting and you're off at whatever time, you walk out that door and you're off.
Yeah.
That's kind of what you have to do a little bit, just with the understanding that sometimes that won't happen every day.
Well, and I've heard two schools of thought, and I know I need to wrap up, but two schools of thought on kind of like triaging your to-do list too, is either writing 3 things down in the afternoon that must get done as a priority, or some people do it first thing in the morning as part of their sort of morning wake up routine. They'll write down like their first top 3 prioritized things that they need to get done that can't be negotiated. And you gave some examples of that earlier. But yeah, it's always great to talk with you, and I wish we had more time to catch up and go through some more scenarios, because I think that people really need that extra kind of thought process, because it is hard to navigate everything yourself without having someone that has already lived that experience. Thank you so much, Jen. I appreciate you so much and for sharing your insight.
Thanks, Renee, for having me.
All right, we'll talk soon.
Are you taking advantage of our new amazing feature? The Certificate Tracker. The free CE Tracker allows you to keep track of all of your CEUs, whether they are earned with us at speechtherapypd.com or through another provider. Simply upload your certificate to your registered account and you're all set. So come join the fastest growing CE provider, speechtherapypd.com.
If you have indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete address in your account profile prior to the course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to be reflected on your ASHA transcript. Thank you for joining us at today's podcast. Remember to go to speechtherapypd.com to learn more about earning ASHA CEUs. We appreciate your positive reviews and support and would love for you to write a quick review and subscribe.